So this is John Culver. He's the CEO of coffee company Starbucks. A few years ago, in an interview with an Indian newspaper, he said, "There are 600 million people that sit in the middle class. That presents a huge opportunity." To Culver and Starbucks, the Indian middle class is like a gold mine. And it's not just them, so many American companies seem to think so. But looking at Starbucks' menu and just taking one random item, a short cafe Americano and hot reusable cup costs roughly 400 rupees. Are there really 600 million Indians who can afford to buy this? According to government data from 2012, which is the latest data we could find, if you live in a city and spend more than 6,300 rupees per month, you're in the top 5% of this entire country. That's only about 200 rupees per day for everything. So if 95% of this country spends less than 200 rupees a day, where does this idea of a 600 million strong middle class that can buy 400 rupee coffee from Starbucks come from? If we divide the country into those who can afford Starbucks and those who can't, it's very clear that if you can, you aren't really in the middle. You're in the top 1 to 2%. You're one of the elites. But this idea of the great Indian middle class is everywhere. Where does it come from? The answer turns out to be complicated. So let's get into some history. When we think of the term middle class, we're usually thinking in the economic sense, a class of society you're in based on how much money you make. So we think that being middle class means you're in a middle income group. That middle income class doesn't really exist in India. When the term middle class was first applied to a group of Indians, it did not refer to an economic class, but a cultural class, a class that existed between the British and Indians. If colonial society had the British on top and the majority of Indians at the bottom, there was a tiny sliver of Indians in the middle who described themselves as the middle class. This group was kind of manufactured by the British to some extent. Thomas Macaulay, the British politician, famously declared that the British government needed to create a class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. These people could then be employed to run the country, and the British could just sit back and, oversee them. Starting around the 1820s and 1830s, Indians trained in English language and culture began to emerge from new colleges in presidency towns like Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta. They went on to become the accountants, clerks, lawyers, and civil service officers that the British relied on to keep the colonial state ticking. This new class was overwhelmingly upper caste Hindu men. In fact, most of them were Brahmins. Since they had dominated Indian society and its knowledge for centuries, they were the ones who found it easiest to access this new education system and the job opportunities that came with it. Historians have a lot of different names for this emerging group, the new elite, the westernized elite, etc. But they refer to themselves as the middle class. But how did they give themselves this label, and where? Well, in newspapers and journals, because they were the ones who owned and published them, in public debates and speeches, because they were the ones organizing those events and the ones invited to speak. This isn't to suggest that they were making up this middleness. The members of this new group may not have all been in the middle in terms of economic or political resources, but when it came to culture, they were. They were acting as kind of middlemen, as they saw it, between the educated modern British and the traditional backward Indians. Or to put it another way, between the powerful and the powerless. Historian Sanjay Joshi says that they use the term middle purposefully to identify themselves as different from both the higher and lower classes, so that they could mediate between the two groups. They position themselves to the British as representatives of the rest of India. And the British seemed happy to accept them as political representatives. And so a class of Indians that were once called a microscopic minority began to speak for millions of Indians. A group of upper caste Hindu men began to speak for Dalits, for other backward castes, for women, for basically the whole country. In case you're wondering about where Muslims fit into this, they had their own educated middle class drawn from the upper castes among them, which again claimed to speak for all Muslims, so they were doing similar things but separately. Obviously, the position of being cultural middlemen came with power, the power to define Indian society to the British. But these men weren't interested in accurately defining Indian society. They were interested in transforming it to how it should be according to them. With the power granted to them by their place in the colonial system, they rewrote whole sections of Indian society, from the traditions of Hinduism to the structure of the Indian family. This process wasn't necessarily straightforward. After all, they were caught between two very different needs. On one side, they had to mimic the modernness of the British, and on the other side, they needed to maintain the traditional caste, class, and religious structures that had made them powerful in the first place. For example, take the question of education for women. The middle class's answer to this question shows these two opposite impulses at work. They saw education as good for women as long as they didn't actually use it. Basically, according to reformers, education was good because it made middle-class women culturally superior to lower-class women who didn't have that education, as well as superior to British women who used that education to compete with men. Joshi describes this new upper caste Hindu middle class as cultural entrepreneurs, like economic entrepreneurs today who are trying to create billion-dollar apps and monopolize the web. These cultural entrepreneurs were keen on disrupting and dominating India's public sphere. Instead of apps, they were monopolizing the very idea of what India was and what it should be. But what happened to this cultural middle class? How did we start thinking of them as an economic middle class? Well, if this is what India looked like then, and then the British go away, you get this. The cultural middle class became the economic elites of today. With independence and the British gone, the value in being part of a cultural middle class disappeared. But the value of that accumulated cultural, or rather caste capital, did not. But Indian elites didn't really want to acknowledge this, so they invented a whole new identity for themselves, the meritorious class. To explore the origins of merit and its connection to caste, watch episode 2 of our past continuous series. To read more about the facts and ideas in this video, check out the description for links to the academic texts that we used as sources.